How are you
I
doing
do.
today? Okay, so complying with the assignment that we should present as part of the third week of our course, we're gonna comply this agenda, right, in order to comply with this schedule, this timeline as well. So we're gonna talk about critical intercultural communication, bureaucracy, and leadership power. We are team two. Um, so in this team is Blake, Chiso, and myself. The purpose of this meeting is to prepare and align the discussion on bureaucracy, intercultural communication under this global organizational context. Basically, we're gonna have a round of introductions, um, and we're gonna touch the points recommended by the assignment. Right? We're gonna have 2 to 3 minutes per person to show our perspective and material, and then we're gonna wrap up with the final takeaways of this meeting. So thanks for being here. Let's start by the round of introductions. If you don't mind, Blake, please, floor is yours.
Yep. My name is Blake Cheary. I'm a 28-year law enforcement officer in Southern California. I've been in the military reserves for 25 years. So I bring those up only in the context of that's how my leadership perceptions and interactions have been framed for a long time. I would say my personal opinion, there's a lot of leadership challenges in both arenas, but more so the civilian side right now, just because of a lot of social factors that are outside the control of a department or an agency. You've got social expectations, you've got challenges between the federal and local government, you've got high profile incidents like George Floyd, you've got and what's going on with the challenges with ICE and what they are trying to do and how that's being pushed back. So there are a multitude of challenges for law enforcement in general, and you have to be able to address those effectively as a leader in the profession, get people to still do their jobs, do it safely, do it legally, do it ethically. So that's kind of where my framework comes from is looking at leadership from a law enforcement and military perspective. They're both similar because the hierarchical nature of the organizations, but they are markedly different in many, many aspects. So that's me in a nutshell. That's what I bring in terms of my perspective and my views.
I appreciate it, Blake. Welcome, Chiso.
Hi, my name is Nnaji, and then that's I'm like the fourth class in this program, and then just like you, Leo, believe we started about the same time. We've been on the same trip to Bulgaria for the global practicum. It was a great experience as well. So my perspective, about leadership, that's what we're talking about. Give it a little bit perspective about that, right? So, basically, starting from a technical point of view, because my background is in engineering, so I'm in manufacturing. So, everything that I had to do with in terms of leadership has to do with improving either processes, improving relationships, improvements on the quality and all that stuff. So, it's always coming from a transformational leadership, ideology where you always want to inspire people to, be the better version of themselves, and then also, continue to push for, the optimal performance as well. So, and then also building a culture where everybody feels that they are part of the group, nobody's left behind, and then they kind of have a sense of belonging, and then they have and that sense of being carried along. So I've always not had like external experience with social aspect of it, maybe leading in the societal, all that stuff. But these courses and also the program in general is kind of part of why I'm doing it, because just want to make sure that I understand leadership from a different perspective, from a global standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, what that looks like when you find yourself in a different location. Like Leo, I understand your job allows you to move from one place to another, interacting with different people. So I'm very keen on learning. So I'm still like on the baby step, and then developing myself into becoming a much more global leader. With experience comes that. So yeah.
Great stuff.
Yeah.
Welcome, Chiso. Well, my turn. I'm Leonardo Tello del Pino, right? Currently, I'm working as a director for a Dutch company that is operating all around the world, and I'm responsible for the LATAM region. So I'm working today in 13 different countries at the same time, delivering maritime resilience and water technology projects, right? So basically, my whole life has been delivering these kind of projects all around the world, more focus in United States, Latin America, Central America, but working very close to European companies, right? Especially Dutch, German, and French and Italian companies, right? So my life is my professional life is very interesting because I was living in different countries as an expat, right? My first boy, born in Buenos Aires when I was developing a $2 billion project in Buenos Aires. My baby girl born in Bogota, in Colombia, when we were doing another mega project there, $4 billion to dredging the Magdalena River. And I was working, in the States. I was working in Argentina, in Brazil, Colombia, Panama, and always going to Europe to coordinate the projects with my colleagues in the Netherlands, especially in France or in Germany, right? And that experience helped me to not only understand but living what are the challenges that we have as global leaders, right? It's not easy. So what I learned is that you need to adapt, you need to get more knowledge about the culture, you need to connect, you need to find what are the commonalities among the different members of the team, and also you need to apply power in different ways to reach the goals. And it's not easy in a multicultural environment. It's not easy when you have 7 hours time difference, right? With Europe, for example, between Latin America and Europe. And it's not easy when some cultures, some members of the team think that they are superior to other members of the team. So this is a big challenge, and I learn a lot. I learn about that. Learning the language, right? So I can speak Italian or French or Portuguese, a bit of English. So that helps me a lot to connect with the people, right? Recognizing that English is the international, let's say, language used by the different leaders today. So, well, we did the round of introductions. We provide some lights on our perspectives. So, what about moving to the first point, which is basically explain how leadership power becomes articulated through rules, procedures, and policies. So the floor is yours again, Blake.
Well, one of the notes that I made was on Rickley's framework applies to rules and how it applies to power being applied to those rules. He breaks down 4 categories of power. Power is the ability to influence. Power is as a relational dependence, like a codependence. Power as control over resources. So I think the term authority could be used in terms of power as well, depending on the circumstances. So the authority to use resources, and power is perception. And that, I think that goes to the point of the highlighted the discussion, perception on the part of a follower. How does power come across to a follower? And what is there, if there's a misinterpretation, how does a leader correct or reconcile that misinterpretation? So those are kind of the things that stood out to me. Powers the ability to influence, and here's where I think you could put authority in, because power gives authority, and your authority can influence either by pointing and saying, do this, or if you have an effective leader, and I'm big on effective leadership, especially in the profession I'm in, that relational dependence, that relational context can help you improve your effectiveness by personal relationships. The rule, powers the ability to influence. Rules allow leaders to direct behavior without being physically present. So I work in an environment where people go out and they act on their own, and a supervisor is responsible for those actions. Different, not just from an administrative standpoint, but oftentimes from a legal standpoint. It's vicarious liability is huge in the law enforcement profession. So rules set that context. They give people enough latitude to be creative, but they also have to operate within specific policies, procedures, rules, laws, and parameters. So I think, to me, that's one of the biggest ones, those 4 components of influence, relational dependence, resources, and perception. I personally think that the rules part of it is probably most important, because that gives people some left and right limits in the rails that they need to follow, but it also encourages, empowers them to be creative in how to solve problems, which is quite honestly 99% of law enforcement. It is solving a problem that is presented to you, be it through investigation, an arrest, deconfliction, like you name it. There's a myriad of tools that an officer can leverage to solve a problem.
Great. Chiso, please.
Yeah, I mean, power in terms of, its effect on leadership, and then how your communication is like, I'm like recapping on what Halwani and Nakayama, argued in their paper, mostly, the emphasis was that, communication or leadership, communication is never neutral, right? And then what that means is like, policies like when you make, if you're in a position of power, may appear neutral most times, but, it can also be perceived based on your position in the, in the organization, for instance, depending on, your identity, participation, how included you feel, in the organization, or how much contribution you think you may have made. So as a person in a leadership position, and as you are leading through, exercising your power through the leadership, you have to recognize that, the way you communicate, information or the organization's policies, it has to be in such a way that, the followers or the people beneath, your position have to understand and feel that they are part of that message, and essentially, when people feel left out, they tend to either sometimes push back, or they tend to exactly, stay quiet, or even, disappear, So, and then there's another thing that's very interesting, when people go silent as well, does not always mean agreement, right? So silence does not always mean that they're in agreement or they're okay. It could be just that because of their own little position or where they are, they just don't want to, either, get in trouble for speaking up and all that. So as a leader, leading through communication and exercising power, making policies, you have to recognize all of these important factors, and then it's like I said, referencing Hulani and Nakayama's work, communication is not just about exchanging information, it has to be, information that is also comprehended, in such a way that it's culturally relatable, especially if you're operating in multiple environments with, different, cultural backgrounds as well. So that's my, understanding.
Thank you, Chiso. So from my end, I'm presenting and showing these slides that compile more or less the readings we had during this week. So I wanna call the attention on what Rickley expressed in the reading on systematic review of power in global leadership. He defines power as influence, relational dependence, resource control, and perception, right? Some things that were captured by Blake's perception. But it's important to recognize also what Halualani sets in the critical intercultural communication, right? Because you need to differentiate the concept and the reality. That is something that I really experience in first person, right? So you need to understand what are these hidden power structures, and this hidden power structure is the real power. So it's all about the influence of the government, the economy, the history, the media, the global markets, even the popular culture, right? So these contexts provide you an idea on where these hidden power structures are, right? So many times I have to exercise my power indirectly. That means that I use culture, right? I use the respect that some of my followers show to certain people, right? That was from the same culture, right? From the same I would say even city or preference, right? In order to uh, uh, make them influence on them to do what I need them to do, right? So then the procedures and policies and the rules help to articulate everything, right? You need to in projects in these mega projects where you don't have a lot of time to explain the things, you need to show the people how to do these things. So the first step in my experience was defining what needs to be done. What needs to be done. Then who needs to do that? When the things need to be done, right? And what are the values, policies that we need to keep in mind, culture, everything, in order to do all the things in the right way, right? On time, on the required time, right? So I would say that these rules and procedures help us to connect, the goals with the people, even with the culture, because inside these procedures, inside these policies, normally the global companies they have I would say they have tropicalized, right? They have considered the locality, the local characteristics or peculiarities of these cultures in order to, generate a seamless connection between what needs to be done, when needs to be done, who needs to do that, and secure the goals of this project, for example, right? So I wanna appreciate what Blake says about empowerment. This is very powerful. I observed that anytime I empower my team, the response back was positive. So they said, "Yeah." So as you said, I'm part. So this empowerment is making them part of the team, right? Part of the group.
It's an
And the other,
it's a personal investment. I think that's I think just the investment aspect goes a long way.
Yeah. And then I just want to add something. So this is from just a recent personal experience. I was having this conversation with a colleague of mine here at work, and then we, she recently got promoted to like a manager position, and very, very good, employee, very smart person. And we were talking. The person that used to hold that position, very smart, but very, very lovable guy. He's very charismatic, but he unfortunately passed away. So, and then this lady got promoted. So we were talking about his leadership, style when he was in that position. And then we're trying to figure out how she can fit in to still replicate similar stuff that he was doing. One of the things I was telling her when we were having this conversation just some couple of hours ago is like, you need to be able to embrace the fact that, people are different, right? So especially I work in a place that filled with people from different backgrounds, Hispanic backgrounds, and then everything, people that speak different languages. So, and then, well, then, the most important thing that I noticed from his style of leadership is like doing the intangibles, those are intangibles, that the things that most people, because sometimes it's good to kind of set a target as a big target as a leader, where you say, I'm going to achieve this, and then that's the big milestone that's going to put us on the map. However, you can also get on the map by doing all those little things, by gradually adding up, that will also take you up to the map. For instance, just showing up, randomly. If we have like a weekend shift and the employees, as a manager, you're probably not going to come, but you just show up randomly and say, hey, I just want to say I'm here in case you guys need anything, stuff like that. And then that kind of feels, I was also telling, the colleague that, it makes them feel, have a sense of belonging, that the fact that they're being appreciated, because we pride ourselves as a family-oriented, organization. But you don't want a situation where, if you're saying you're family-oriented and people come into work, they don't feel like they are part of the family, right? They don't have that sense of family, so you have to make sure that everybody's needs, you're not going to be perfect, but you get to at least make sure that they feel, as important as possible that they can be.
But you also need to keep in mind what Blake says. So you need to balance, right? Maybe I'm very focused on that, because in my experience, it's not just the transformation part, right? So you're talking about something that is really important, but in a project, you need to be efficient, as Blake says, how we can balance, this care for our people versus the compliance of the goals of the organization, right? So this balance is also important, and is more important, I would say, when you have this time constraint, right? So when you are working in an organization, right, like the motor industry, right, or a bureaucratic organization, you have time to develop all these soft skills. You have time to make the transformation in your organization, thinking in the long term. But when you are delivering projects, you have this time constraint that oblige you to make the balance. So in my experience, I learned that you should spend good time on creating this team, as you said, Chiso, but at the same time, you need to make them comply in the goals of the project, right? In the time slot. And then this was the challenge on my experience, that generated a lot of friction in the team, to be totally honest with you guys. Just for the sake of time, I think we have touched the first two topics, right? Because we were talking about the conceptual aspect of this, the application of leadership power, how the procedures and rules articulate this implementation, and we were also speaking about our experiences, right? But now for the third topic, we need to present an example of these procedures that we normally apply during the exercise of our leadership in our experience. So Blake, again, floor is yours.
So I looked at this as again, a law enforcement context, and one of the biggest liabilities in law enforcement is using force and having to use force. And quite honestly, 99.99% of the time, a police officer doesn't decide when they have to use force. They are being reactive. There are certain circumstances where being proactive and going on the offense is necessary. But in my experience, number of years, those situations are pretty small. So I looked at use of force, for example, and in use of force context, there's a lot of considerations, right? It has to be legal, it has to be reasonable, it has to be within policy, it has to be within the law. As of late, and this is something that's developed over the years, and I'm not going to say that I agree with it, I understand it, but it also has to be in line with societal expectations, right? And keep in mind that a lot of people who do critique law enforcement actions, there are some experts out there, but there are also a lot of people who have never had to respond and think about and make split-second decisions in these circumstances. So there's a lot of factors that go into thinking about when, how, and what force to use in a given circumstance. And which one was it? When you go back to Rickley, and they talk about the rules and what I've talked about before, that's how a supervisor or leader sets the stage for his or her officers deploying in the field and making a decision to use force or not. Because, again, the supervisor is not always going to be there. And ultimately, it's going to be a supervisory responsibility to potentially investigate a use of force and or determine if it's out of compliance. So setting those left and right limits, especially on use of force, is crucial and is very important from a leadership perspective. And that's done in a number of ways. And in fact, in California, use of force is a mandatory topic to be covered every 2 years for every single police officer. Driving, firearms, domestic violence, and use of force or defensive tactics are the required components for every 2 years. So how does an effective leader, how does a leader set the stage and go back to the empowering part? Give their subordinates the comfort to make decisions on their own, but while staying within those constraints. Because if you look at many use of force lawsuits, it's not just the officer that gets sued, it's the supervisor who gets sued, it's the department who gets sued, it's the entity like the city or the municipality gets sued. The use of force is a huge deal especially when it comes to liability. And I go back to like I said, Rickley, and talking about rules and establishing those rules and left and right limits. A supervisor can really set the stage in a positive way, saying, by talking about specific incidents, by covering case law, state law, codified law, case precedents, talking about different scenarios, and getting officers in a mindset to realize that when they have to use force, there are limitations, but you have some latitude within those limitations. And I think, like I said, I go back to the left and right limits and the rules. I think those are crucially important, and that's a component that an effective leader can really leverage to make sure that his or her officers are safe within the law, within policy, and thereby that supervisor is also protected as well. So I kind of tried to look at it from there. I don't know if that makes sense or not. Trying to look at it from
very clear.
Yeah.
Totally clear. I'm learning a lot because those are extreme situations for me. So getting this insightful information is really, I appreciate all this insightful information because it's pretty new for me, right? That I'm not in that position. So please go ahead, Chiso.
So my perspective, my experience is, with regards to leadership, it's, about mostly revolve about relationship building. I'm gonna give some, instances, from recent experience, and then talk about, how that, makes a leadership effective. For instance, if you are leading like a global organization that operates in many, multiple, locations of different cultures, you have to be able to build relationship, referencing what Blake is, talking about in terms of law enforcement. We've seen like in recent, history, in recent situations where we have, tensions between law enforcement and then, the communities that they serve. And then most times it's because of lack of that relationship that's been built where, law enforcement is perceived as the enemy in most cases. And then the community sometimes also don't trust. Sometimes you see situations where, instead of calling in the law enforcement when things happen, people tend to take take laws into their hands, or even rather not call, avoid, just because of lack of trust, lack of that relationship that has been built. So very important to build relationship when you are in a leadership position. I'll give you another instance. When we were in Bulgaria, we had I think a seminar with the manager of Hilton, when he was talking about his experiences when he first arrived in Bulgaria. I paid really good attention, as an expatriate that's working in Bulgaria for the first time. One of the first things he did was to, get into the kitchen, get into the other areas, not just be sit at the office as the regional manager and just start, dishing out policies. He got there, introduced himself to the people, and also with the customers and the people that come actually that will be patronizing the business. One of the things that he said that struck me the most was like, he had to understand how to properly communicate with Bulgarians, because it's quite different being a, someone from Sweden, I think it was, no, sorry, not Sweden. Where is Dr. Bieri from?
Germany.
Germany, yeah. So, being from there is quite different, and he also referenced that saying that, in Germany, they most likely prefer emails if you want to communicate, but Bulgarians rather have you sit up with them one-on-one, so that's how you build relationship. You have to understand, what the followers actually want, and then act on it. Then now building that relationship, why it's very striking for me and very important is because as a leader, what makes you a proper leader is legitimacy, right? And one of the ways for you to legitimize your authority is by relationship. People have to actually believe in you, follow you because they actually believe in you, not because they are scared. That's what separates you from a tyranny, or from tyranny of a tyrant, and because if you don't have that legitimacy and that relationship that you have formed over the years, then it's almost like you are, they're only obeying you because they are scared of you, and that's a dangerous place to be. And then I hope every leader that's in a position, or any person that's in a position of leader, leads understanding that people actually follow them because they believe in their vision, they believe in what they have, not just because they are scared. So that's my perspective about relationship building.
Yeah. Good. So I gonna be very pragmatic, and I want to show you, why these procedures, these processes and policies are important in a global and an international business, right? Because you now need to connect people from different cultures, from that they have different languages, different perspectives, working in the same team for the same project in another country, right? And that's why it you need to have tools that can connect everything, that can connect people, cultures to reach the objectives. What you are saying here is our webpage, Haskonin, is a Dutch company. This is the company I'm working for, right? So as you can see, everything is in English. Everything is included in the SharePoint. So you go to WorkWise, right? In WorkWise, you have the map of processes, right? Because you don't have time to explain everybody every time what needs to be done, right? And that's why these processes are important. So if you are delivering projects, so you go to this project management, right? And then well, I gonna reinitiate my session. So you select project management, and in project management, you're gonna find all the processes that you need to comply in order to communicate with other people in different time zones, with different cultures and different everything, right? So you go to project management, you do double click, and you see the different processes. Then you, for example, if you are delivering the process, you go to this part, which is project execution. You go there, right? And you can see what is the, different procedures that needs to be complied in order to maintain the company way of working under our own standard. So you can organize by matrix, for example. So you have the activities, and the stakeholders and what they are doing at what moment, right? So if you want to see just the process, right? So this is a important way, and then I'm shifting a little bit to this bureaucracy, right? At some point, the global organizations need some bureaucracy, but you need again to balance at what extent, right? Because as private companies, we don't like to be bureaucratic. We don't like to spend a lot of time in complex processes that are gonna generate more complexity, more than the one we already have. So these processes need to be smart enough, lean enough, clear enough to communicate, to organize, to interconnect our people in different parts. So sorry for being a little bit bored, but I need to say that in these kind of organizations, that is needed. That is needed. It's very different from a local one where you can have this in-person close connection, similar what Chiso is saying, right? So you can create that connection. But what about if these two persons, or if this team is working, one in the Netherlands, another in Panama, another in Vietnam, the other one for example, we have another in South Africa, right? Is difficult. So I think these processes are very powerful and very useful to connect people. So for the sake of
So
time,
I
yeah.
have
So
I have a
go.
question, follow-up question with that. So have you ever had to deal with like a situation where, like an ethnocentric situation where, people's, tend to, you know what I'm talking about, like,
Several
or
times.
yeah, either you are on the receiving end or you are maybe perceived as the one giving that, right? So where people tend to see you as someone that viewed, or you tend to see someone that views stuff from their own, cultural experience or perspective. So have you
Both
ever,
scenarios.
especially when working with people from different, how do you guys target and also, tackle that, situation?
Yeah, both scenarios. I think Blake is gonna provide a very interesting perspective on the people applying this power over, someone that maybe is not, for example, American, right? So I had both experience, and the tip I can share with you, Chiso, is that it depends a lot on the power. So who is having more power. When I was working as the director or the manager, it was more easy to me, right, to connect with my people. The other way around, I had to use more adaptability, right? I had to adapt myself. You cannot change the country. You cannot change all this chunk of people. You need to adapt, right? Instead of, just pushing the barriers, or trying to impose your way of working. No, my experience was that is failing. What is working is looking for the commonalities, trying to adapting yourself, right, without renouncing to be yourself. You know what I mean? So not not negotiating your values, but adapting your way of working, your way of thinking, in order to connect, and then you can work together. But Blake, please.
I think you hit on an important point, is connect in terms of finding a commonality. Like, so San Diego has, I think, 70 different countries represented within the city, and obviously, as a law enforcement officer, it's incumbent upon me to try to understand at least the basics of some of those, especially in the neighborhoods where I worked. Failing to do so could have amplified any challenges that I ran into. But from that the communication perspective that you were talking about, finding a commonality, that's where the education comes in. That's where relations come in. That's where understanding not just understanding the other side, but the perception that they may have about law enforcement. For example, there's a wide array of East African countries that are representative in one of the neighborhoods. Obviously, they look at law enforcement way different than Americans do because of how they were treated in their home countries. That's a challenge for me. We have to overcome that, and that's where simple communication comes in. Chiso, your point before is communication is not just the exchange of information. I think that's super important. It's also trying to find the commonalities, trying to understand perceptions, not just me understanding theirs, but I want them to understand my
where you're coming from, yeah,
and my obligations in some ways too, because there's legal obligations to abide by. So it's from a global perspective, like it has been interesting to live and work in San Diego, because there are so many different cultures to understand and interact with. And if for newer officers, for these newer generation of officers I'm working with, I kind of feel like they don't see it that way. It is the authority that's behind the badge, and people have to respect that regardless, which is not always the case. So yeah, I think from a, like I said, global perspective, it's just being able to connect even on a very basic level, and try to talk to people, try to understand their side, but also getting your point and your side across as well.
Yeah, and then that's the emphasis I was trying to lay earlier on. I just wanted to just add real quick that communication is a part of that relationship building, because you have to talk to the people that you are leading, or the people that you are serving in any particular platform. Because if you don't, then everybody will just be acting out of their own God-given instance, and then that's a very dangerous place to be. And it's not just even in terms of like what we are. I think one of the things, I know this particular class focusing on culture and all that, but also there is like a generational thing too. Like, like for instance, Blake, your experience dealing with the, let's say millennials will be different from dealing with, boomers, baby boomers, for instance, how they perceive, law enforcement, and then how, Gen Zs perceive law enforcement. It's a completely different thing. So having that communication, having that, relation, building out, is be able to give you that insight into, okay, where are these people also? But you made a very, very important point as well, to also explain to them what your obligations are, where you're coming from, why you are doing the things the way you are doing, so that's very important. So it's very important as a leader to keep talking, to keep building relationship. And then you may not have time, but if for a long time, it helps over time.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Thanks for that, Chiso. Blake, I think we have touched all the points that has been requested in the exercise. So I'm gonna invite you for the final round of reflections to wrap up and close this meeting. So based on my experience as expat during long time, and having this mixed family and working in different cultures, I prepared some slides that you were showing. So I wanna close by saying that for me was important uh, generating clarity right? Using a plain language and explain the why behind the rules I'm trying to implement. The other thing was being consistent. You cannot say something and doing exactly the opposite. That is well appreciated by different cultures. The other thing is something that Chiso was highlighting and that I call co-design. So I'm not coming here to impose my way of working. I want to co-create the things with you. The other is keeping in mind the context is very powerful, very powerful. My recommendation, anytime you arrive to a new country, before you need to read a little bit about the political situation, about the history, about the language, about even the slang. The other thing that I learned is proportionality. So you need to use the minimum procedure needed for accountability. So you explain clear what needs to be done, how needs to be done, but also you need to maintain them accountable. But I've been influenced by 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 you guys on this empower thing, empower the people. That is very important. And finally, as you were saying, talking and talking and talking, communicating, this is feedback. So it's important giving and receiving feedback. Those will be my main takeaways. So we are going the other way around. So Chiso, go ahead, and we close with Blake.
So my takeaways, I'm gonna be funny a little bit. Everything you said, Leo, and then some. There's some is like, in terms of communication, and there's this thing that always goes around, but I don't know most people if they understand. Communication is not just about, like what I said earlier. It's not just about speaking, or you want to make sure that the message is also, being, understood. What does that mean? For instance, it goes both ways. When you are in a conversation with somebody, like as we are having this conversation right now, you know, you have to listen to understand people, not just listen to respond, right? Communication is not just also speaking, it's also listening. you know. Leadership is also not being a leader, it's also part of followership. Followership is part of it. So all of those things are very essential. So, and then another takeaway is, integrity. Integrity is something very, very, most people neglect. But what that means especially in any line of work, and especially as a leader, is doing the exact same thing even when nobody is watching. Not doing it just because we're expected to do it, and then on your own you start doing another. So you have to maintain the same standard at all times, because that's part of what builds trust. Because people know that you have integrity. They can align with you. And especially, and this is not common, especially in politics or anymore. People say something else behind the scenes, they start doing another thing, and that's why there's a lot of lack of trust in our leaderships across the board. So integrity is very essential, in terms of, that's another takeaway. And then I think then plus all the other stuff that you say, Leo, I agree with them.
Appreciate it. Appreciate it,
Yeah.
Chiso. So last but not least, Blake.
So I got a couple different takeaways, and I think this goes back to Chiso. You mentioned legitimacy, a leader with legitimacy, and I think there's another word that is often associated and connected to that. That's credibility. And in my mind, a leader is not granted credibility by authority or position, right? That credibility comes from their followers. And to your point, yes, your leadership is also part of followership. And I'm of the opinion you have to have been a good follower before you can be an effective leader, for many reasons. You got to know the job. You got to know the job. You have to have the credibility. You have to understand what looks right and what isn't right, from the subordinate perspective, before you can be effective in managing that from the leadership perspective. And I think that's the final takeaway: is can't overstate the importance of perspective. A leader projects reinforces rules for reasons, right? Downward pressure from the administration, legal constraints, case law, whatever it is in my particular profession. But it's also, you have to understand the perspective of the follower and how that's received. And you talked about, I think one of your slides, you talked about explaining the why, right? And I think a lot of leaders really forget to do that, and that creates a disconnect that is sometimes challenging to overcome. Instead of saying, just because I told you to, a 30-second conversation as to the why can really work to mitigate challenges like that. And I've always done that in every position I've ever been in. Is here's what needs to be done. Here's the why, right? Here's the end state. Because once you have sold it that way, it goes back to one of the very first important points, is investment. People become invested in it. And especially if you show them and you demonstrate to them that their investment is meaningful, they feel rewarded in that respect. And I don't think that feeling of accomplishment on the part of a follower can be measured or overstated. It's super important. If you can create that in a follower, a team I think is bound for success.
Absolutely.
Fantastic, gentlemen. It was a pleasure getting your insightful information. All your perspective was much appreciated. So, Dr. Bean, we have finalized this group conversation video. We made it despite all the problems and all the complicated agenda. Well done, team. See you around.
Thank you, Leo. 1 second. Thank you very much for also organizing and making sure that this it's arranged properly for that. And then Blake, I'm also in San Diego, just in case you're wondering. So maybe we'll connect at some point, hopefully.
Apply
Yeah.
coercion.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So
Definitely.
yeah. All right, Leo.
Yeah,
Good
Leo,
to see you again. All right, guys. Yeah.
Thank you for setting it up. Thank you very much for setting it up. I think
right.
your work set us up for success. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Leo, for that. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
Stop recording.
Oh, okay. He hung up
See you,
anyway.
Blake.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.